I'm really glad to introduce OWEN CHAPMAN. He's a assistant professor in Concordia University and an artist. And his presentation is Echoscape, representing remixing auditory space. You have 55 minutes.
Hear me okay? All right. Okay. So I will be presenting in English. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. I have a tendency to speak a little fast, so I'm going to try to be a bit slow, and I'm going to be reading. I have some examples to show. So yeah, the title, Echoscape, representing remixing auditory space. This is an image from the Echoscape platform, which we've been developing in my research lab at Concordia University. I'll be showing a video later on in the presentation of what the application actually does, but I will be discussing it in detail. I will start with this quote, though it's a bit long. I'll read it out because it sets the tone for what I want to talk about this morning. So maps intrigue us, perhaps none more than those that ignore mapping conventions. These are maps that find their essence in some other goal than just taking us from point A to point B. They are a vehicle for the imagination, fueled up and ready to go. We look at these maps and our minds know just what to do. Take the information and extrapolate from it a place where they can leap, play, gamble, without that distant province of our being, the body, dragging them down. Of course, part of what fascinates us when looking at a map is inhabiting the mind of its maker, considering that particular terrain of imagination overlaid with those unique contour lines of experience. If I had mapped that landscape, we ask ourselves, what would I have chosen to show, and how would I have shown it? The coded visual language of maps is one we all know, but in making maps of our worlds, we each have our own dialect. So Echoscape is an interdisciplinary research creation project that explores and interrogates the nexus between audio experiences, mobile devices, and built environments, both actual and virtual. Echoscape is a dynamic audio recording and sound composition tool for creative collaborations and exchanges. Echoscape is an immersive arena for the exploration, sampling, and remixing of sounds collected with the iOS app Audio Mobile. So I'm kind of presenting two projects at the same time here. One is an application for the telephone. It's only good for iOS devices at the time being. It's called Audio Mobile. It allows you to make recordings and upload them to a database. And then Echoscape is a secondary application that draws those audio recordings from the database and presents them in a virtual environment. So Echoscape involves a navigable 3D computer simulation of the original recording environment. So if I make a recording on a street corner there, and I look at an Echoscape, I get a rendition of the buildings and the streets and stuff from where the recording took place. In order to do this, we use information from various databases, so the OpenStreetMaps, and something called the Shuttle Radar Topography Mission. This is open data that's online. And it's built on the Unity gaming engine, which I'm sure some of you know about. So in Echoscape, one encounters a resonant virtual architecture seeded with dynamically interacting sound files. I'll showcase it in a few moments. The term Echoscape is kind of a combination of an idea called what we refer to as the soundscape in my domain, soundscape studies. Echoscape is drawn from our interest in the phenomenon of echolocation, a term that is being studied by cognitive scientists interested in the plasticity of the brain and the ability of our senses to reconfigure themselves. So echolocation is how bats navigate the world. Ship captains, before the days of radar, would use echolocation in foggy conditions to navigate through difficult channels. Those who have lost their sight can develop the capacity to echolocate by clicking their tongue and listening. You may have seen a guy, I'm forgetting his name right now, he can ride a bicycle. He's completely blind. He can ride a bicycle through clicking his tongue and getting feedback from the buildings and the streets around him. This capability of seeing through sound lets those without sight be mobile. Drawing on this term, Echoscape plays with the interrelationship of sound, space, and sight and movement to explore, individually and collectively, our navigation through a simulated world. Acting as a platform for composition, through mixing and sequencing audible traces from both urban and natural environments, Echoscape is driven by a series of interrelated research questions regarding acoustic ecology. 1. Can we effectively and evocatively represent our experience of daily soundscapes and echolocation? For instance, that sound we're hearing right now. How can we engage with that in a meaningful way? Can we effectively and evocatively represent our experience of daily soundscapes and echolocation through virtual means? What's the difference between a straight map, like we find, say, on a Google map, versus the 3D environment of Unity? What are the creative limits of such representations, and how might such representations invite playful remixing and or detailed forms of composition? So, to give a bit of context, so Audiomobile is the linked application that works with Echoscape. It's available for free on the App Store. I would be very pleased if there were some more downloads today after this presentation. There's a few images from it, from Snowy Montreal about a year ago. So the way the application works is you begin by taking a photo, and as soon as the photo is taken, an audio recording begins. Once you press stop, certain information has been captured automatically. So your GPS coordinates are captured automatically, date and time, and that kind of thing. And you can add metadata, so a title for your recording, and various other notes. And then you can upload it. You can email it to yourself if you don't want to share it publicly, but you can also publicly upload it to our online map, which is starting to become more and more full as the application was released about a year ago. And the online map, it's based on a Google map in this case for Audiomobile, and it represents the sounds at different points on the map that you can access them and listen to. So there's a very, very quick example. Oh geez, this is zoomed way in. Okay, never mind, I'll show that after. I had an example of fireworks in Paris that I thought you guys would keep that. Oh, here we go. I'm not plugged in for audio. So this was an individual I met last year at in Aix-en-Provence at an event that was organized by Locus Sonus, and he downloaded my app and has been using it since then. And it's a bit hard to see, but you get an image for each recording, and in the sound file you can download it, you can share it with people, etc. So, Audiomobile on its own, it's a sound mapping app. Sound maps are something maybe that you are familiar with. There's an enormous amount of activity right now in terms of sound maps online. Here's a short list that I compiled a little while ago. The ones in green are some of the most interesting sound maps that are out there, in my opinion anyway. But almost all of these feature a two-dimensional map, which is based on Google Maps, and then you have these points on the map that you can click on and get access to the sounds that were recorded there. So Echoscape, like I said, it uses the database that Audiomobile is building to provide a different kind of experience. Echoscape draws on aesthetic and operational parameters from new interfaces for musical expression. You may have heard of the acronym NEAM. There's a conference that happens every year internationally around this topic, new interfaces for musical expression. We also work with location-based or located media, virtual architecture, soundscape studies, and mobility studies. A wider goal of the Echoscape project is to produce a series of rich and participatory mobile compositional experiences within the Echoscape application, drawing upon the archives of rich media content we are accumulating via our linked iOS application Audiomobile. So maybe now I'll just jump to the video example so you can get a sense of what Echoscape does. I was going to open it up and show you a real Echoscape moment, but I think this will be better. I'll play these videos. The video quality is not very high. So this, actually, I'll just explain. Echoscape takes the Audiomobile recordings, and then when you zoom in on a particular place on the map, it will show you a 3D rendering of that space, and the recordings appear as these orbs that just kind of exist in the space. This actually, it's hard to tell, but this is the Olympic Stadium in Montreal. The Echoscape environment, when it makes its 3D rendering of the real space, it remains very abstract. So you can't see much of the built environment here, but all of those points of light are different audio recordings. This was a composition that was produced very, very recently by a research assistant on the project. And what Echoscape allows you to do is both access sounds that were recorded in the original environment, but then also upload your own and create a kind of compositional arena. So pretty soon he's going to click on one of these sounds and you'll see how the interface works. These are mostly sounds that he's uploaded himself. So it's a little bit of a false example because normally you would be encountering field recordings. Whereas in this case, these are sounds that he's uploaded that have musical qualities to them already. And for each sound, you can get in there and you can adjust things, volume, start and end points for the sound file. You can create loops and different kinds of things. And then you'll just pitch. The video here. We'll come back in a second. But as you move around in the space, the sound is panning left and right depending on your perspective. It gets louder or softer as you move closer or further away. You can't read the writing, but in the top left-hand corner, there are various options. So record what you hear, load a sound, save the current scene. So we're really trying to make a compositional environment here where you can both set up something that people could experience, but where you could also be outputting your sound as you're moving through the space and create effectively like a musical track. I think that'll do. Again, like I said, this example is a little bit funny because most of those sounds, well, in fact all the sounds that you just heard, were pre-composed in a studio environment and then uploaded into Echoscape, as opposed to working with the sounds that you could have found there according to automobile recordings that have been uploaded to the site. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about sound mapping and some of the prescriptive, I think, elements that come out of the current Google Maps-based approach to two-dimensional sound mapping, which is so common. So the top-down two-dimensional perspective of nearly all the many contemporary online sound maps, like the list that I showed. This top-down approach has prescriptive effects that go beyond the constraints of simply representing ephemeral, dispersed things like sound as points on a map. I mean, already that's a strange abstraction, to take a single point and try to use that to represent a sonic moment, which obviously exists in many spaces at the same time. These two-dimensional models cannot showcase movement, for instance, arguably an essential function of the extended embodied and situated cognition that these interfaces can enable. So I'm quoting here Bernard's introduction to this weekend's series of questions about extending cognition through devices. These two-dimensional maps also do not allow for the type of immersion that Michel de Certeau articulates in his tactical approach to navigating through a city as a practice of everyday life. The God's eye view that he presents from the top of the World Trade Center in his Walking in the City chapter is the de facto standard to which all sound maps adhere, principally due to their almost universal reliance on Google Maps for their interface. From our very initial stages, our development team wanted to avoid any essential link to Google applications in our development for Echoscape. For automobile, we're using Google, but we're not for Echoscape. So we're working with open source sets of data, like the Shuttle Radar Topography Mission and OpenStreetMaps. Our representations remain somewhat abstract, especially in terms of the representation of built environments. So OpenStreetMaps gives you street names and things like that. It also, depending on the city that you choose, will have varying degrees of representations of the built environment. So in Montreal, for instance, the downtown core is represented quite well in terms of 3D buildings, and Echoscape can render these, but once you leave the downtown core, it really starts to look really flat, because OpenStreetMaps doesn't have a lot of data. In Montreal, the people have uploaded representing particular buildings. Other cities like Paris, I've noticed, are quite different. There's a lot more activity. So our representations become more or less abstracted. But I think the abstraction is a strength of the platform because it immediately puts the user into a playful state of interaction and engaging with the sound aspects of the map more than the visual. And then recording one's output of Echoscape can also produce, both for beginners or neophytes, non-sound composition types, or people who are really into sound composition, it can produce artifacts that are usable both to represent one's experience in Echoscape, but also for other types of purposes. So one thing with Echoscape is it creates these it's music, but it's very spatialized types of music. It's very ambient. So for soundtrack work and that kind of thing, it's a very interesting compositional platform. These design parameters reflect important interventions that we want to make with the Echoscape project in terms of challenging the overwhelmingly predominant Google Maps model, which is accompanied by one of my research assistants, Sam Tulin, has described as a documentary, this is what it sounds like here approach. So a lot of these sound maps represent themselves as being kind of like a documentation of here's what Paris sounds like, here's what Louisiana sounds like, here's what New Orleans or Montreal or whatever sound like. Like it's a sort of a one-to-one representation which is being presented. On the other hand, as we all know, any sound map or any representation is just that. It's a singular kind of attempt to give a user or an outsider access to a space, but it's a representation. It's not necessarily real. If someone wants to make a claim for a certain level of authenticity for a particular representation, like the signature sounds of a city, say, that authenticity needs to be grounded through a reflexivity and openness to the limitations of the totality represented. So I could walk up here today and make a recording and upload it to the map and say, this is what it sounds like outside of Sorbonne, and in this particular Panthéon, etc. But it would only be one day, one moment, one particular take, obviously, on what that space sounds like. And so to pretend it is somehow a universal a representation of the space outside this building would be a false abstraction, I think, and we're working against that. So while there are multiple different ways in which sound mapping as a practice can be accused of being reductionist, we don't want to say that this is an essential quality of the practice or the technology involved, but rather it's a question of disposition and attitude around what it is that you're producing. So again, to come back to this quote that I started with, the idea is to present a map which is, from the get-go, obviously abstracted, subjective, and unique. And I think that as an experience for a user, it's a more honest and reflexive way to present a map than to say, here's a two-dimensional representation of what this space sounds like for all time, which is what these sites generally tend to. If you want to download Echoscape, by the way, again, it's very much in an alpha stage. It uses the Unity gaming engine. You'll have to download Unity as well, but it's all free. And here's the address that you can get the program at. There's a instruction manual as well, which gives you a sense of how to use this space. Very much like a first-person video game. So I'm going to finish. 7 minutes? Okay, perfect. I'm going to finish discussing a little bit the notion of mobile devices as ubiquitous digital interfaces. So the Echoscape project addresses the current ubiquity of mobile smart devices with integrated GPS, microphones, and cameras by employing them as frontline tools for creatively engaging with the soundscape. Echoscape is linked to the audiomobile app, as I've mentioned, this part. Echoscape reconfigures the mobile phone as a source of playful engagement with one's sonic environment. Now, unlike some of the augmented reality stuff we've been talking about already, there is a bit of a time delay. So you make recordings in audiomobile, then you have to go back onto a desktop computer to use Echoscape. It's not something yet that you can use on a mobile device, although we're working towards that end. The project takes advantage of the new practices afforded by mobile devices for making ubiquitous, spontaneous, dynamic recordings in your daily life. Audiomobile uses the built-in features of smartphones or other devices. One could argue that it extends cognition through automating note-taking and annotation practices for field recording. So conditions like date, time, and GPS points are all saved automatically. So there's extending of our cognition. Multiple GPS coordinates. In the case of audiomobile, one of the things that's particular about it is that you can actually tag multiple GPS coordinates. So I could go on a walking tour and have a trace of that walk become a part of what's uploaded to the map. That does make it somewhat unique from some of the other maps out there that are more point-oriented. The audio recording is automatically normalized on an iPhone. By normalized, I mean the volume is adjusted to be as loud as possible without distorting. Again, another extension of our cognition, another kind of downloading of processes that normally one would have to take care of to the device itself.
Photographs are taken with each recording, allowing for easier distinctions to be made between recordings afterwards, as mnemonic cues useful for organizing lists of recordings, as well as situating the eventual listener into the place of the recording. In terms of gesture, recording on a mobile device can appear a lot like texting, allowing for a certain anonymity. So one thing when you're making a recording on the street with a cell phone is you can kind of just stand there in a more anonymous way, as opposed to having a microphone and a device out in front of you, which allows for, I think, more natural and dynamic recordings to take place. Audiomobile's database, when it's accessible to the Echoscape platform, turns the sounds that have been recorded into objets sonores, to echo Pierre Schaeffer, which I think, again, it both brings us closer to the sounds and the location, but it also quickly allows us to go off into abstract realms of exploration of those sounds in a music concrète style way, which I think is very interesting. So, to quote again my research assistant who just finished his PhD and wrote a lot about these topics, Sam Tulin, he distinguishes between sound mapping and locative media. Understanding locative media is what Bernard has described as a nomadic artistic engagement, or a use of a device in a nomadic sense. That, when deployed over a particular terrain, makes use of location-sensitive elements of mobile devices to activate game sequences in real time and real place. The playful nature of Echoscape's interactivity makes it broadly associable with the notion of game, but the fit is a little bit maybe uncomfortable. When users remix sounds in Echoscape, they're definitely playing something, but are they playing a game? This question hinges on the issue of outcomes. Echoscape provides an open world with the possibility to interact with thousands of sounds to make recordings and play with audio loops. The platform is built on the gaming engine, Unity, and can certainly be employed by savvy users to support a type of gameplay that could be designed into a particular scene that one might create. But this hasn't been built into our interface as of yet, and one of the reasons that I'm excited to be here is to think about different ways to integrate gaming strategies or narrative strategies into the presentation of Echoscape to potential users. Because I think, as will come out over the course of this weekend, these narratives and these gaming strategies or protocols or whatever you might want to call them are really integral to getting a user involved in your application quickly. Echoscape allows for the development of different types of worlds: representational, virtual, fictional, and various shades in between. For instance, a user can upload their own sounds into a custom Echoscape simulation, thus playing with different layers of sounds, both recorded on location, versus introducing these kind of fictional samples. What emerges from engaging with sounds in Echoscape is a spatialized sonic texture that represents one's movement, one's mobility within the space, as well as the playful integration of sound effects, tempo variations, loops and filters, etc. So to think about research creation, which is a kind of a Canadian term, other people might describe something around the notion of critical making, or anyway, engaging in artistic practice, creative practice, to give you a platform upon which to make kind of theoretical or historical observations. This is really much at the heart of our project in terms of a methodology and an orientation. And the question is, what's at stake? How do digital interfaces accompany mobility? And how is mobility defined in these interfaces? What is the role given to digital interfaces to connect people in their spatial and social environment? How do design scenarios and stories involved in urban games work, and what do these things do? While I think that a digital interface like Echoscape does actually provide something quite unique, I'm not going to hinge its significance on its originality. In many ways, the project builds on too many other practices or technologies to even describe them effectively, let alone make bold pronouncements of being the first instance of a new form of sound processing. So we're building on practices of sound blocking, field recording, remixing, sound mapping, locative media, sound signal processing, looping, layering, movement, spatial panning, improvisation, and all of these key terms have different valences in other ongoing initiatives. I don't want to pretend that Echoscape is somehow deeply unique, but there is a uniqueness to it that I think is why we're pursuing it. And it's an open world. And this is the key. The parameters of interaction are constrained, but they are not limited, at least not completely. The user is invited to explore what the audiomobile app provides in terms of a pre-existing database, or to go out and create their own field recordings to add to the mix. The interface becomes a mirror. It responds to what we give it with reflections that move us affectively, emotionally, physically, precisely because it shows us the limits of our imagination. The interface defamiliarizes our works and our worlds, reminding us how, as the protagonist Mason and his new friend Nicole say at the end of the Richard Linklater's 2014 film Boyhood. I watched this film on the airplane coming over, and some final lines really resonated with me as I was finishing the paper. At the end of the movie, the very last scene, Mason's new friend Nicole says, "You know how everyone's always saying, seize the moment? I don't know. I'm kind of thinking it's the other way around, you know? Like the moment seizes us." And then Mason responds, yeah, I know. It's constant. The moments. It's like it's always right now, you know? To which Nicole responds simply, yeah, and moving in. We pull out our phones, access the internet, record from and overlay information into our immediate present, and we feel a connectedness with others. Of course, there are many who would insist that this takes us out of our present moment, casting our attention to distant, globally connected alternate realities. The discussions we are having this weekend look at the different ways that active, engaged users of mobile devices can defamiliarize or estrange their environments, turning these environments into playing fields to engage actively in different, networked, and unpredictable ways. But what I want to insist is that these interfaces, these platforms, do not so much give us control over our quotidian experience or our daily experience, as they provide portals to two senses of it. They provide portals through which to witness, to feel the wonder of daily life, of small rituals, localized sounds, fleeting images, overlaid with the content of that vast repository of extended human cognition that is the internet. Our attention is projected back towards ourselves, revealing elements of what Heidegger called